The garage door was still locked from the inside. That was the first thing that stopped Detective Ramos cold. He had worked burglaries for 11 years. He had seen everything: forced doors, broken windows, disabled alarms. He had seen every trick professionals used and every mistake amateurs made. But he had never seen this: a garage locked from the inside, and a dog inside it that had not made a single sound, not one bark, not one scratch, not one sound of any kind through the entire robbery. He stood at that garage door for a long moment. He placed his palm flat against the painted wood. He felt nothing. No movement, no vibration, just silence. He looked at the two officers behind him. Nobody spoke. Then Ramos unlatched the side door and pushed it open. What he saw inside that garage would stay with him for the rest of his career. When he finally wrote it into his report 3 days later, he chose every word with unusual care, because what he was describing had no clean explanation. And in 22 years of detective work, he had learned something important. The things with no clean explanation were always the things that mattered most. But to understand what Cooper did in that garage, you have to understand Alina Hayes. And to understand Alina Hayes, you have to go back 4 years, to the morning her husband did not wake up. Harold Hayes had been a high school history teacher for 31 years. He was the kind of man who forgot where he put his keys every morning and remembered the name of every student he had ever taught. He made coffee before Alina woke up. He placed the cup on her nightstand with a folded paper towel underneath it, so it would not leave a ring on the wood. He did this every single morning for 43 years of marriage. Without being asked, without needing thanks, it had become so routine that Alina stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing the sound of the refrigerator, the way you stop noticing your own breathing. She noticed it the morning it was not there. She woke at 6:15 as she always did. She reached to the nightstand without opening her eyes. Her hand found smooth, empty wood, nothing else. She opened her eyes, no cup, no folded paper towel, and something deep in Alina's body understood before her mind caught up. She was out of bed and in the hallway before she had made any conscious decision to move. Harold was gone quietly, the way he had lived. The doctors said his heart had simply stopped sometime in the early hours. He had not suffered, he had not woken, he had just finished. Alina sat in the kitchen for a long time that morning. The phone began to ring, then ring again. The coffee maker beeped. It had finished a cycle she did not remember starting. Her daughter Sarah drove in from Memphis. Her son Paul flew in from Seattle, the house filled with people and food, and the particular low hum of a family trying to hold itself together. But what Alina remembered from those first days was not the people or the food. It was the silence after everyone went home. The particular silence of a house that had held 2 people for 40 years and now held 1. She stopped sleeping properly. She stopped eating the way she should. She sat in Harold's chair in the evenings because it still smelled like him, and she was not ready to wash that away. Her daughter Sarah was the one who suggested the dog. Alina resisted for 3 months. She was 71 years old. She did not have energy for a puppy. She did not want the responsibility. She said she was fine. She said she was managing. Sarah drove her to the rescue shelter on a Saturday in October anyway. Just to look, she said, just to see. Cooper was in the 3rd kennel on the left, 4 years old, surrendered by a family that had relocated internationally and could not take him. He was sitting in the back of the kennel with his head resting on his front paws. He was not barking like the dogs on either side of him. He was not pressing against the gate or performing for attention. He was just waiting. Alina stopped walking when she reached his kennel. Cooper lifted his head. He looked at her with his dark brown eyes. He did not jump up. He did not make a sound. He just looked at her with the calm, steady attention of an animal that has learned to take the world as it comes. Alina put her fingers through the gate. Cooper walked forward and pressed his nose against them. She took him home that afternoon. What happened over the next 4 years was not dramatic. There was no single moment that changed everything. It was slower than that, quieter than that. It was Cooper sleeping at the foot of her bed, so she could hear him breathing in the dark. It was his weight against her leg when she sat in Harold's chair. It was the way he waited by the front door at the exact time she usually returned from her morning walk. Alina started sleeping better. She started eating at the table again instead of standing at the kitchen counter. She started calling her daughter on Tuesdays and her son on Thursdays. Her neighbor Margaret told Sarah that Cooper had given Alina back something that grief had taken. Not Harold. Nothing could give her Harold back, but something else. Some reason to move through the day with purpose, something that needed her. Some warmth in a house that had gone very cold. Elinor would never have used those words herself. She was a practical woman, a former schoolteacher, not given to sentiment. She would tell you Cooper was a good dog, a quiet dog. A dog that did not cause trouble and did not ask for much. But there was a moment the previous spring that told a different story. Cooper had been sick for 3 days with a stomach infection. Elinor had sat on the bathroom floor with him at 2 in the morning, her hand resting on his side. In the dark and quiet of that bathroom, she had said something out loud that she had not said since the morning she stood at Harold's nightstand and felt the empty wood. She told Cooper she was not ready to lose anyone else. Cooper looked at her in the dark with his steady brown eyes. Then he put his head in her lap and closed his eyes. The night of the robbery was a Wednesday in November. Elinor went to bed at 10:15, her usual time. Cooper slept at the foot of the bed. The neighborhood was quiet. Sycamore Drive was the kind of street where people knew each other's cars and noticed unfamiliar ones. The kind of street where nothing bad had happened in a very long time. The 3 men had been watching the house for 5 days. They knew Elinor's routine. They knew what time she left for her morning walk. They knew when her lights went off at night. They knew her car was the only one in the driveway. They knew she lived alone. They knew there was a dog. They had seen Cooper in the yard through the fence. The dog was the variable they had planned for. The one they called Danny had dealt with dogs before. His method was simple: isolate the dog before entry. A dog locked away cannot alert, cannot interfere, cannot become a problem. He had done it twice before at other properties. Both times it had worked perfectly. What none of them understood was the specific nature of this particular dog. They had seen a golden retriever, gentle breed, family dog, not a guard dog, not aggressive, not a threat. They had seen the breed. They had not seen the animal. At 2:17 in the morning, the first man came over the back fence. He crossed the yard in darkness, moving low and fast. He reached the garage from the side yard. He worked the lock in under 40 seconds. He opened the garage door just wide enough to slip inside. Cooper was sleeping on the old blanket Elinor kept for him on the garage floor. Cooper raised his head. The man had a collapsible wire crate folded under his arm. He set it up in under a minute. He coaxed Cooper in with a small piece of food and latched the door. Cooper did not resist. He did not growl. He walked into the crate, turned around once, and lay down. The man latched the crate. He pulled the garage door down from inside. He went to the back door and opened it for the others. All 3 men were inside Elinor's house within 3 minutes of coming over the fence. Cooper lay in the crate in the dark, and he listened. He could hear the men inside the house. The sound of drawers being opened in the bedroom. Footsteps moving from room to room. The low murmur of voices keeping communication to a minimum. The sound of Harold's old roll-top desk in the study being opened. The one Elinor had never been able to bring herself to clear out. Cooper had spent 4 years learning every sound that house made. He knew the particular creak of the 3rd step in the hallway. He knew the sound of the kitchen drawer when someone searched for a flashlight. He knew the difference between the sounds of a house at rest and the sounds of a house being violated. He lay still in the crate, and he did not bark, he did not scratch, he did not whimper, he did not make a single sound, because Cooper was not panicking, he was paying attention. Every scent that drifted under the garage door was being recorded. The particular scent of each man, the fabric softener on the jacket of the one called Danny, the cigarette smoke embedded in the clothing of the second man, the faint chemical smell of the gloves the 3rd man wore. Cooper filed all of it. He lay still in the dark, in the locked garage, in the wire crate, while 3 men moved through Elinor's home, and he waited. He was not waiting because he had given up. He was waiting because he understood something the 3 men did not. His moment had not come yet, but it was coming. A golden retriever in a wire crate in a dark garage should bark. That is what dogs do when they are frightened, when they are alone. When something is wrong, they bark, they scratch. They press their bodies against whatever is holding them. They make noise until someone comes. It is not a choice. It is instinct. It is older than any training. Cooper did none of these things. He lay in the crate in the dark and he was completely still, not frozen with fear, not paralyzed, not defeated, still, deliberate, focused. Any person who truly understood dogs would have seen it immediately. His breathing was slow and even. His eyes were open and forward. His ears were raised. He was not an animal in panic. He was an animal paying attention. He could hear the men inside the house. The particular sound of a dresser drawer being pulled open too fast. Footsteps crossing the hardwood floor of the living room. The muffled thud of something being set down. The quiet murmur of 2 men communicating in as few words as possible. Cooper knew those rooms. He knew every sound they made when a leaner moved through them. He knew the difference between the sound of a leaner opening the kitchen drawer and the sound of a stranger opening it. He knew the difference, and it was filling him, every sound, every scent that slipped under the garage door, every vibration that traveled through the concrete floor beneath him. He was taking all of it and storing it, the way he had always stored things, with a fidelity and a completeness that no human being would ever fully understand. He did not bark, because barking would have told the men where he was. Barking would have made them nervous. Barking would have changed what they did inside that house. Cooper lay still, and he remembered everything. Inside the house, Alina was asleep. She slept through the first 20 minutes of the robbery. The men were professional. They knew how to move without making noise. They had done this before. They knew which rooms to clear first. They knew to keep their voices low. They knew to avoid the areas near the bedroom until everything else was done. Alina stirred once. A sound in the living room reached her somewhere between sleep and waking. Something that was not quite right. She shifted in her bed. Her hand moved toward the nightstand. Then the sound stopped, and she sank back into sleep. What woke her was not a sound at all. It was the absence of one. Alina Hayes had lived with Cooper for 4 years. In those 4 years, she had learned his sounds the way she had once learned Harold's. The particular way his breathing changed when he was deeply asleep. The soft sound he made when he was dreaming. The quiet shift of his weight on his blanket when he turned in the night. She had never once gone to sleep without being able to hear him. She woke at 2:41 in the morning. She lay still in the dark. Her hand rested on the empty nightstand. Her eyes were open, but she did not move. The house felt different. She could not have explained how she knew. She was a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher, not a detective, not a soldier. But she had spent 43 years learning to read a house, learning what it sounded like when everything was right. And she knew, in the wordless way of someone who has paid close attention to life for a very long time, that everything was not right. She lay still and listened, and then she heard it. A footstep in the hallway, not Cooper's footstep. Not the familiar soft pad of 4 paws on hardwood floor, something heavier. 2 feet, careful and deliberate, moving slowly toward her bedroom door. Alina did not panic. This was something people who had not known her well would have found surprising. But the people who had known her well would not have been surprised at all. She had managed a classroom of teenagers for 37 years. She had broken up fights and talked down rages and sat with children who were falling apart. She had learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury that did not help anyone. She slid to the far side of the bed without making a sound. She lowered herself to the floor. She moved to the corner behind the bed, the one furthest from the door. She sat with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, and she waited. The bedroom door opened. A flashlight beam swept across the room. It moved across the dresser, across the nightstand, across the foot of the bed. It paused for a moment on the spot where the jewelry box had been. The jewelry box was already gone, taken from the dresser 20 minutes before Alina had woken up. The beam moved to the closet. It held there for a moment. Then it moved on. Alina pressed herself against the wall behind the bed and did not breathe. The man in the doorway stood for 11 seconds. Alina counted every one of them. Then he moved on down the hall. She exhaled. She stayed on the floor behind the bed. She listened to the sounds of the house. She tracked the movement of the men as best she could from her corner. She heard the back door open, then close. Then the particular silence that follows when people who should not be in a place have finally left it. She waited 3 more minutes. Then she crawled to the bedroom door on her hands and knees. She reached up and turned the lock. Then she went to the window. She watched a dark van pull away from the curb 2 houses down. She watched until its taillights disappeared at the corner of Sycamore and Elm. Then she stood up. She stood up straight, the way she had always stood in front of her classroom. The way a person stands when they have decided that what just happened to them is not going to be the thing that breaks them. And she went to find her phone. She called 911 at 2:56 in the morning. Her voice was steady. She gave the dispatcher her name, her address, a clear description of what had happened. The dispatcher asked if she was injured. Alina said she was not. The dispatcher told her to stay in her bedroom and wait for officers. Alina unlocked the bedroom door. She walked down the hall. She checked the kitchen and the living room and the study and both bathrooms. She confirmed the house was empty. Then she went to the garage. She unlatched the side door and pushed it open. Cooper was in the wire crate in the dark. He was not scratching. He was not barking. He was lying with his head on his front paws and his eyes open and his ears forward. When the beam of Alina's flashlight reached him, he raised his head. He looked at her. His tail moved once. Not excited, not relieved, not the tail wag of a dog who has been waiting anxiously for someone to come, something slower and more deliberate than that. Something that looked less like relief and more like acknowledgement, like a person nodding to confirm they understand. Eleanor unlatched the crate. Cooper walked out. He pressed his body against her leg and stood there. Eleanor put her hand on his head. Neither of them moved for a moment. A 71-year-old woman and her dog, standing in a dark garage at 3 in the morning. Both of them steady, both of them whole. The first police unit arrived 4 minutes later. Eleanor walked out to meet them with Cooper at her side. She gave the responding officer a clear and detailed account of everything she had heard and seen. She described the van, the direction it had gone, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the flashlight beam across her bedroom, the 11 seconds she had counted while the man stood in her doorway. The responding officer would note in his report that she was one of the most composed witnesses he had encountered at a fresh crime scene. He also noted that the dog had not barked. He wrote it down because it struck him as unusual. A dog locked in a garage during a home invasion. That had not barked, not once. He could not explain it. He wrote it down and moved on because there was a scene to process and evidence to collect and a report to file. He did not yet understand. The not barking was not a detail. The not barking was the whole story. Cooper sat beside Eleanor on the front porch while the officers worked the scene. He did not pace. He did not whine. He sat pressed against her leg with his dark eyes open and his breathing slow and even. One of the younger officers stopped near the porch and looked at the dog for a moment. "That your dog?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. "His name is Cooper." The officer looked at him. "He was locked in the garage the whole time?" "Yes." The officer shook his head slowly. Most dogs would have gone crazy in there. All that noise, the strangers, he would have been barking his head off. Eleanor looked down at Cooper. Cooper looked up at her. "Yes," she said quietly, "you would think so." The officer moved on. Eleanor kept her hand on Cooper's head. She thought about the crate in the dark. She thought about the 40 minutes between when the men had locked Cooper inside and when she had opened the door and found him lying there. Calm, quiet, eyes open. She had owned dogs before, as a child. Briefly in the early years of her marriage before children and teaching had filled every hour. She understood something about what dogs did when they were frightened and alone. They made noise. Cooper had not made noise, which meant Cooper had not been frightened, or it meant something else. It meant that Cooper had understood in whatever way a dog understands things that making noise was not the right choice. That something else was required, something quieter. Something that required patience and stillness and the long discipline of paying attention when every natural instinct was pointing in the opposite direction. Eleanor sat with that thought for a long time on the front porch while the lights from the police units swept the yard and the officers moved through her house cataloging what had been taken. She thought about Harold's roll-top desk in the study. She thought about whether the wooden letter box was still there. She could not bring herself to go and look yet. She would look when the officers were done. Right now, she needed to sit still for a moment. Cooper pressed closer against her leg. Eleanor kept her hand on his head. The night was cold and clear. A light wind moved through the bare oak trees along Sycamore Drive. Somewhere down the street, a porch light was on. It cast a small, warm circle on the sidewalk below it. Everything looked exactly the way it had looked the night before, and nothing was the same at all. Detective Ramos arrived at 6:47 in the morning. He had been called in at 6:15. His supervisor had flagged 2 things in the responding officer's report. The first was the level of planning and coordination the robbery suggested. This was not random. This was not opportunistic. Someone had watched this house. Someone had known the routine. The second thing his supervisor flagged was the note about the dog. Ramos read it in his car before going in. Dog was locked in garage by suspects prior to entry. Dog did not vocalize during incident. Witness reports dog appeared calm upon discovery. He read it a second time. Then he got out of the car. He walked to the garage before he walked to the house. He stood at the side door for a moment. He placed his palm flat against the painted wood. He unlatched the door and pushed it open. He stepped inside. The wire crate was still in the center of the garage floor where the man had left it. Ramos crouched beside it and looked at it carefully. The latch was undamaged. The frame was unmarked. There were no scratches on the interior walls of the crate, no sign of distress of any kind. Then he looked at the floor around the crate. He looked at it for a long time. Then he stood up and found his flashlight and came back and crouched down again with the beam aimed at the concrete. And he saw it. Faint smear marks on the concrete, in a slow, deliberate arc around the bottom edge of the crate. The particular pattern left by a dog pressing its face low to the ground and moving its nose back and forth in a careful searching motion. Ramos had seen this before. In training demonstrations, in field work with the 9 unit, it was a tracking pattern, not panic, not distress, a deliberate, focused tracking pattern. Ramos stood up slowly in the empty garage. He turned off the flashlight. He stood very still, and he thought about a dog lying in a wire crate in the dark. Not barking, not scratching. Moving its nose along the floor in slow, deliberate arcs while 3 men robbed the house of the person it loved most in the world. He thought about what that meant. Then he went inside to meet Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor made Ramos coffee without asking if he wanted any. She set it on the kitchen table in front of him and sat down across from him and folded her hands and waited. Cooper lay under the table pressed against her feet. He was not anxious. He was not reacting to the stranger in the house. He was simply present, simply close. Ramos noticed this. He opened his notepad. He looked at Eleanor for a moment before writing anything down. In 22 years, he had learned to look before he wrote. The way a person held themselves told you things that their words sometimes did not. Eleanor Hayes sat straight. Her hands were still. Her eyes were clear. This was not a woman who had been broken by the night before. This was a woman who had been through something harder than a burglary and had come out the other side still standing. He asked his questions. She answered every one of them with the calm, precise memory of a person who had spent decades training herself to observe accurately and report honestly. She described the sounds, the footstep in the hall, the flashlight beam across the bedroom, the 11 seconds at the doorway, the van pulling away toward Elm Street. Ramos wrote everything down. Then he asked the question he had been waiting to ask since he read the officer's note in his car. He asked about Cooper. Eleanor looked at the dog under the table. Then she looked back at Ramos. She said Cooper had not barked once. From the moment the men locked him in the crate to the moment she opened it and found him, not one sound. Ramos asked if that was unusual. Eleanor said it was completely unlike anything she had ever seen from him. He asked what Cooper did when she opened the crate. Eleanor paused. She thought about it carefully. Then she said something that made Ramos set down his pen. She said Cooper did not come to her immediately. She said he went to the corner of the garage first, the corner by the old workbench. He pressed his nose to the floor in that corner and moved it in a slow pattern she had not seen him do before. Back and forth, slow and deliberate, for almost a full minute. Then he came to her. Ramos picked his pen back up. He asked if she would mind if he went back to the garage. He found it in the corner by the workbench. He would have missed it if he had not been specifically looking for it, if he had not already seen the tracking pattern around the crate, if the note about the dog not barking had not been sitting in the back of his mind since 6:15 that morning. He crouched down in the corner with his flashlight aimed at the concrete floor. The same slow, deliberate arc marks. The same pressing and tracking pattern, concentrated in this one specific corner of the garage. Ramos looked up from the floor. He looked at the wall above the workbench, and he saw it, a ventilation gap 2 inches wide, running the length of the garage wall just below the ceiling line, the kind of gap that connected the garage to the home's interior ductwork, the kind of gap that allowed air to move between spaces, the kind of gap that would carry sound and scent. Ramos stood very still in the corner of the garage. He thought about what that meant. For 40 minutes, while 3 men moved through Eleanor's house, every sound they made had been traveling through that ductwork. Every word they spoke, every drawer they opened, every footstep on the hardwood floor. All of it had been filtering down through that ventilation gap and settling in the air of that corner of the garage. Cooper had not been locked away from the crime. He had been listening to it the entire time. Ramos took a photograph of the gap. Then he took a photograph of the floor. Then he stood in the corner of the garage for a long moment and looked at the crate in the center of the floor and thought about a golden retriever lying still in the dark. Not because he was helpless, not because he had given up, because he was working. He went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at Eleanor across his notepad. He asked her one more question. He asked if he could bring a 9 unit to the garage. Eleanor looked at Cooper. Cooper looked up at Ramos with his dark, steady eyes. Then Eleanor said she thought that was a very good idea. The 9 unit arrived 40 minutes later. The handler was a young officer named Tors. His dog was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois named Rex. Tors and Rex were one of the top tracking teams in the Nashville department. Rex had worked missing persons cases, narcotics detection, and evidence recovery. He was exceptional at his job. Tors brought Rex into the garage on a loose leash and let him work the space. Rex was immediately interested in the crate. He worked around it in a careful circle, his nose moving rapidly, his body low and focused. Then he moved to the corner by the workbench. Rex pressed his nose to the ventilation gap and held it there. Tors watched him. He said nothing. Rex held the gap for nearly 30 seconds. Then he dropped his nose to the floor directly below the gap. He began to work the floor in the same slow, deliberate arc that had left the marks Ramos had photographed. Tors looked at Ramos. He said quietly, "There's a scent trail here, multiple people, coming through that gap." Ramos nodded. How old? Tors watched Rex work. "Hours," he said, "but strong. Whoever these people are, their scent settled hard in this corner." Tors took Rex to the side door next. Rex pressed his nose to the gap at the bottom of the door and held it. Then Tors opened the door and took Rex into the side yard. Rex moved to the fence line in under 2 minutes. He found the gap in the wooden fence on the south side without hesitation. He pulled Tors through the gap into the alley behind the property. He tracked east along the alley for 30 feet, and then Tors called him off, because they had found what they needed. At the spot where Rex stopped, there was a cigarette butt on the ground, and beside it, barely visible against the dark asphalt, a partial boot print in a thin smear of motor oil from a parked vehicle. Ramos photographed both. He stood in the alley and looked back at the garage, then at the fence gap, then east along the alley toward Elm Street. He thought about Cooper in the corner under the ventilation gap, working the air for 40 minutes, filing every scent, every sound. He pulled out his phone. He called the forensics team. Alina was in the kitchen when Ramos came back inside. She was standing at the counter. She was not doing anything, just standing with her hand resting on the counter and looking at the window above the sink. The window that looked out over the backyard. Ramos sat at the table. He told her what he had found in the garage, the ventilation gap, the tracking marks, what Rex had confirmed. He told her clearly and without softening it because she was the kind of person who deserved a clear explanation and would understand one. Alina listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Ramos wrote in his notes and underlined. She said she had known. When she opened that crate and saw Cooper lying there with his eyes open and his breathing slow, she had known he was not simply waiting. She could not have said how she knew. She was a practical woman. She did not believe in things she could not explain. But she had known. Ramos asked her what she thought Cooper had been doing. Alina looked at Cooper under the table. She said she thought he had been doing the only thing available to him. She said she thought he had been paying attention with everything he had. Ramos wrote that down. He underlined it twice. Then he asked her about the wooden letter box from the study, whether it had been taken. Alina's expression changed slightly. It was small, just a shift around the eyes. The kind of shift that comes when a person thinks about something they are not ready to look at yet. She said she did not know. She said she had not been able to go into the study yet. Ramos nodded. He told her forensics would finish within the hour. He told her she could look then. Then he stood up and gathered his notepad and thanked her for the coffee. Cooper walked him to the front door, not aggressively, just present, the way he had been present all morning, moving alongside Ramos to the door and then sitting and watching him go. Ramos paused on the front step. He looked back at Cooper. Cooper looked back at him with his dark, steady eyes. Ramos thought about what a Train 9 costs the department to certify. The months of specialized training, the formal scent detection curriculum, the assessment programs, the certification process. And then he thought about a golden retriever with no training and no certification lying in a dark garage in a wire crate, tracking the scent of 3 men through a 2-inch ventilation gap, mapping the crime in the dark, waiting. He shook his head slowly, then he walked to his car. He had a case to close. The forensics report came back in 48 hours. The cigarette butt from the alley contained a DNA profile. It went into the national database at 9 in the morning. It returned a match by 3 in the afternoon, 6 hours. The man's name was Derek Lund, 34 years old, 2 prior burglary convictions, released 14 months ago after serving 26 months of a 4-year sentence. His mugshot showed a lean-faced man with flat eyes and the particular expression of someone who had already calculated how to answer every question they were going to be asked. Ramos looked at the photo for a moment. Then he moved to the boot print. The tread pattern matched a specific work boot sold through 3 sporting goods retailers in the greater Nashville area. It was a starting point, not a confirmation, but Ramos had built cases from less. The third piece was the van. Alina had described it clearly. Dark-colored, full-size van, older model, no markings. She had seen it pull away heading east on Elm Street. Ramos requested traffic camera footage from the intersection of Sycamore and Elm covering the window between 2 and 3:30 in the morning. The footage came back grainy but usable. A dark blue Ford van, late 90s model, passed under the camera at 2:52 in the morning heading east on Elm. The plate was partially obscured. A bent corner of the frame blocked 3 of the 6 characters, 3 readable characters: make, approximate model year. Ramos gave it to his team. 8 hours later, they had a registration. The van was registered to a business called Lund Property Services. The business address was a storage unit facility on the east side of Nashville. The registered owner was a woman named Carol Lund, Derek Lund's mother. Ramos drove to the storage facility that afternoon. Carol Lund was a small woman in her late 50s. She answered their questions in the parking lot with the particular wariness of someone who had given answers about her son to police before and expected she would give them again. She confirmed Derek had access to the van. She confirmed she had not seen him in 4 days. She gave them his last known address without being asked. The address of a man who had not been careful enough. Derek Lund was not at his last known address. His landlord confirmed he had not been there in 5 days. Ramos put out a bolo and went back to his car. He sat for a moment. He had the DNA. He had the van. He had a name. What he did not have yet was the direction. He did not know where Lund had gone after leaving Sycamore Drive. He did not know the secondary staging location. He did not know where the van had been parked before it appeared on the traffic camera. He needed the trail. And there was only one place he knew where the trail started. He drove back to Sycamore Drive. Elena opened the door before he knocked. She had seen his car from the window. Cooper was beside her, his red collar bright in the afternoon light. Ramos told her what he had found: the DNA match, the van registration, the name. He told her they were looking for Derek Lund and that he expected to have him in custody within days. Elena listened. She nodded. She did not ask how certain he was. She did not ask what would happen if they did not find him. She was not that kind of person. She asked if there was something else she could help with. Ramos looked at Cooper. He said he had a question that was going to sound unusual. Elena said go ahead. He asked if he could spend a few minutes alone with Cooper in the garage. Elena looked at him for a moment. He could see her thinking it through. Not doubting him, just processing. Then she said of course. She led him through the house and opened the garage door from inside. She started to come in with them. Ramos asked gently if she would give them a few minutes. He explained what he was thinking. He said he wanted to see if Cooper would go back to the corner on his own, without any prompting, without any variables he could not account for. Elena understood immediately. She went back inside and closed the door. Ramos sat on a low wooden stool near the center of the garage. He unclipped his radio and set it on the workbench. He sat quietly. He did not make any sound. Cooper sat near the door for a moment. He looked at Ramos with his dark eyes. Then he moved to the crate still sitting in the center of the garage floor. He sniffed it carefully. He moved around it in a slow circle. Then he went to the corner by the workbench. He pressed his nose to the floor. He began to move it in the same slow, deliberate arc, back and forth, careful, methodical, the same pattern that had left the marks Ramos had photographed that morning. Ramos did not speak, did not move. Cooper worked the corner for almost 4 minutes. Then he raised his head. He looked directly at the ventilation gap above the workbench. He held very still. Then he went to the side door of the garage and pressed his nose to the gap at the bottom of the door. Ramos stood up slowly. He opened the side door. Cooper went out into the side yard without being asked. His nose was low. He moved to the fence line. He found the gap in the south fence. He went through it into the alley. He tracked east along the alley. He tracked for 40 yards, then he stopped. He raised his head. He looked east down the alley, toward Elm Street, toward the direction the van had gone. Then he turned and looked back at Ramos. Ramos understood. He was standing in the alley behind Elena's house, watching a golden retriever with no formal training, no certification, no law enforcement background, standing at the exact point where the secondary trail began and looking at him with absolute calm intelligence. He had been a detective for 22 years. He was not a man who allowed himself to feel things during an active investigation. Feeling things during an active investigation was how you made mistakes. He had learned that a long time ago, and he had held to it through every case he had ever worked. But standing in that alley, he felt something he did not write in any report. He felt that the 3 men who had locked this dog in a garage and walked away confident they had neutralized the threat, had made the single most significant miscalculation of their careers. They had locked away the witness. They had not understood that the witness did not need to see them. Ramos crouched down in the alley. He looked at Cooper. Cooper looked back at him, steady, patient. Waiting, Ramos said quietly, "Good boy." Cooper's tail moved once. The same single slow wag, not excitement. Acknowledgement. Ramos stood up and called Torres. He told Torres he needed Rex back at Sycamore Drive. He had a direction and a distance. He wanted Rex to work the alley east from the property line toward Elm Street and continue as far as the scent held. Torres arrived in 20 minutes. Rex worked the alley exactly as Ramos described. He tracked east to Elm and turned north. 2 blocks north on Elm, he turned into the parking area behind a strip mall. In the far corner of the parking area, behind a commercial dumpster, Rex alerted on a specific patch of asphalt. Ramos walked to the spot and crouched down. A second cigarette butt, a discarded pair of nitrile gloves, and pressed into a soft patch of dirt at the edge of the asphalt a complete boot print. Same tread, same size, same man. Ramos stood up in that parking lot and looked at the evidence markers and thought about Cooper standing at the end of the alley looking east. He pulled out his phone. He called his supervisor. He said he thought they were going to close this one. Derek Lund was arrested 4 days after the robbery. He was at a motel on the outskirts of Murfreesboro, 30 miles southeast of Nashville, room 12, ground floor. He had not moved far enough and he had not moved fast enough. When Ramos and 2 officers came through the door, Lund was sitting on the edge of the bed watching television. He looked at Ramos, then at the 2 officers. Then he sat back and put his hands on his knees. He had been arrested before. He knew the sequence of what came next. He moved through it without resistance. In the patrol car on the way back to Nashville, he asked Ramos one question. He said they had been careful. He said they had worn gloves for most of it. He said the dog had been secured. He asked how they had found him so fast, not with hostility, more like genuine professional curiosity. Ramos thought about how to answer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said they had a good witness. Lund looked at him in the rearview mirror. Ramos did not elaborate. The second man was located 6 days after the robbery. His name was Terry Briggs. Ramos found him through the boot tread pattern. A specific retailer. A loyalty card purchase. A name that matched a known associate of Derek Lund. Briggs was picked up at his girlfriend's apartment in East Nashville. He was cooperative in the limited way of someone who confirms the basic shape of things without volunteering anything that increases his own exposure. The third man took 11 days. His name was Carl Mossy. He had been smarter about distance. He had driven to Louisville the morning after the robbery and stayed with a relative there. He was located through a combination of cell tower data and a tip from a confidential informant. Nashville detectives coordinated with Louisville police. Mossy was picked up outside a convenience store 3 blocks from his relative's address on a Tuesday morning. He did not resist. All 3 were charged with felony burglary, felony theft, criminal trespassing. The district attorney added a conspiracy charge given the evidence of planning and surveillance. The case was strong. The forensic evidence tied all 3 men physically to the alley behind Alina's house and to the strip mall parking lot. The van was recovered from a storage facility in Hermitage. Inside it were items taken from Alina's home, including Harold's wooden letter box. It was returned to Alina intact. The reading glasses were still inside it. The Civil War stamp collection was still inside it. The personal letters were still inside it, tied with a piece of kitchen twine the way Harold had always kept them, neat and ordered and exactly where he had left them. Alina sat at her kitchen table with the box open in front of her, her hands flat on the table on either side of it. She did not move for a long time. Cooper lay under the table with his head resting on her foot. The trial was 8 months after the arrests. Alina was asked to testify. She agreed without hesitation. She sat in the witness box in the Davidson County Courthouse on a Thursday morning in July. She answered every question the prosecutor asked with the clear, precise memory of a former schoolteacher who had spent 37 years training herself to observe accurately and report honestly. She described the sounds in the house, the footstep in the hallway, the flashlight beam across her bedroom, the 11 seconds she had counted while the man stood in her doorway. She described finding Cooper in the crate, the way he had gone to the corner before coming to her, the single slow tail wag when she opened the door. The prosecutor, a woman named Daphne Crowley who had been doing this work for 18 years, asked her questions in a careful, deliberate order that built the picture piece by piece. Then the defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. He asked Alina whether she had been afraid. Alina considered the question. She took her time. She was not a person who answered before she was ready. Then she said yes. She said she had been afraid. She said she was 71 years old and she had been alone in her house in the dark, and she had been afraid the way any reasonable person would be afraid in that situation. Then she said something the defense attorney had not anticipated. She said she had also felt something else. She said that, when she thought about Cooper in the garage, when she pictured him in there in the dark, she had felt certain that he was doing something. She could not have explained what she meant by that at the time. She said it was not a rational thought. It was something more like knowing. She said she had felt, in the middle of being afraid, that Cooper was not simply locked away. She said she had felt that he was doing his part. Whatever his part was, in whatever way was available to him, he was doing it. The courtroom was quiet when she stopped speaking, completely quiet. The defense attorney stood at his table for a moment. He looked at his notes. He looked back at Alina. Then he said he had no further questions and sat down. The prosecutor said she had no further questions either. Alina stepped down from the witness box. As she walked back to her seat, she passed the table where the three defendants sat. She did not look at any of them. She looked straight ahead. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap and waited. All three men entered guilty pleas before the case went to a jury. Derek Lund received 4 years. Terry Briggs received 3 years. Carl Mossy received 3 years with 18 months suspended. The judge cited the planning and surveillance of a vulnerable victim as an aggravating factor. A 71-year-old woman living alone on a quiet residential street. Watched for 5 days before the men made their move. Ramos attended the sentencing. He sat in the back of the courtroom and watched the proceedings and said nothing. After the sentencing, he found Alina in the hallway outside the courtroom. She had Cooper with her on his red leash. She had brought him because she said she could not think of a good reason not to. Cooper pressed his nose against Ramos's hand when he crouched down. Ramos looked at him for a moment. Then he looked up at Alina. He told her he wanted to say something he had not put in the report. He said that in 22 years of detective work, he had never had a case develop the way this one had. He said the cigarette butt and the boot print and the van registration were what built the case in a courtroom. That was the evidence. That was what convicted 3 men. But he said the direction had come from Cooper. He said the morning in the alley when Cooper had stood at the end of the trail and turned and looked back at him. That was the moment he had known where to send Rex. That was the moment the investigation had turned. He said he wanted Alina to know that. Alina listened to all of it. Then she looked at Cooper. Then she looked back at Ramos. She said she was not surprised. She said she had known from the moment she opened that crate and saw him lying there. Calm, eyes open, breathing slow. She had known he had not simply been waiting in the dark. She said she did not know how she had known. She was a practical woman. She did not believe in things she could not explain. But she said some things did not require explanation. She said some things simply required paying attention. Ramos nodded. He said goodbye to Alina. He shook her hand. He reached down and put his hand on Cooper's head one final time. Cooper was still. His eyes were forward. His breathing slow and even. Ramos straightened up and walked to the elevator. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets while he waited for the doors. He thought about a dog lying in a dark garage, in a wire crate, on a concrete floor, listening through a 2-inch ventilation gap to 3 men who believed they had been careful enough. 3 men who had looked at a golden retriever and seen a family dog. Not a witness, not a tracker, not the thing that was going to bring them down. The elevator doors opened. Ramos stepped inside. He was already thinking about the next case. 3 months after the sentencing, a journalist named Kevin Park wrote a short piece about the robbery on Sycamore Drive. He had heard about it from a court reporter who had been in the Davidson County Courthouse the day Alina testified. The court reporter had been covering that courthouse for 9 years. She had heard a lot of testimony. She said she had never heard anything quite like what Alina said about Cooper doing his part. She told Kevin Park about it over coffee on a Thursday morning. Kevin Park was not a crime reporter. He covered community stories, the kind of pieces that ran on page 12 and got forwarded around by people who wanted to send something good to someone they cared about. He was not expecting much when he drove out to Sycamore Drive on a Tuesday afternoon and knocked on Alina's door. Alina answered with Cooper beside her. She offered him coffee. He accepted. They sat at the kitchen table and she told him the story. The same way she had told it to Ramos and to the prosecutor and to the jury, clearly, without embellishment, with the specific detail of a woman who had always believed that the truth did not need decoration to be powerful. Kevin Park asked her about the part where she had felt certain Cooper was doing something in the garage. He asked how she would describe that feeling now, 3 months later, with the trial behind her and the men in prison and everything settled. Alina was quiet for a moment. She looked at Cooper under the table. Cooper looked back at her with his dark, steady eyes. Then Alina said something that Kevin Park wrote down word for word and read back to her twice to make sure he had it right. She said that when Harold died, she had learned something she had not expected to learn. She said she had learned that love did not stop simply because the person it was directed at was no longer there. She said it changed form. It found new places to go. She said Cooper had come into her life, and she had loved him the way you love a being that returns you to yourself. And she said she genuinely and practically believed, that on the night of the robbery, Cooper had not been a passive creature locked in a room. She said she believed he had done what every being does when someone they love is in danger and they cannot reach them. She said he had paid attention with everything he had. He had listened, and he had remembered, and he had waited for the moment when he could be useful. Then she said the line that Kevin Park would think about for a very long time after that afternoon. She said she thought that was what love looked like when it had no other options. Kevin Park published the piece on a Thursday. By the following Monday, it had been read by more people than anything he had ever written. By the end of the week, it had been picked up by 3 regional newspapers and 2 national outlets. By the end of the month, it had been translated and published in 7 countries. The detail that caught people was the same one that had caught the court reporter in the Davidson County Courthouse. Not the arrests, not the forensics, not the 3 guilty pleas. It was the dog in the dark. The dog that had been locked away and had chosen not to bark, not to scratch, not to do the obvious thing, that had chosen instead to be still, to listen, to remember, to wait for the moment when it could be useful. People wrote to the Nashville scene. Kevin Park forwarded the letters to Alina with her permission. She read all of them. She was not a person who cried easily. She had not cried in the courtroom when the 3 men received their sentences. She had not cried in the alley when Ramos told her what Cooper had done. But she cried reading some of those letters. She cried reading the one from a woman in Oregon. The woman wrote that her husband had died 8 months before, and she had been struggling with something she could not put into words. She said the line about love finding new places to go had helped her understand something she had been carrying without knowing what it was. She cried reading the one from a retired police officer in Ohio. He had worked with 9 units for 19 years. He said the description of what Cooper had done through the ventilation gap was the most accurate description of natural scent tracking behavior he had ever read outside of a formal training manual. He said most people never understood what dogs were genuinely capable of because most people never paid close enough attention. Alina wrote back to both of them. She wrote back to most of them. She had always believed that when someone took the time to reach out, you took the time to respond. She typed her responses on the old desktop computer Harold had set up in the study, the one she had not moved or replaced, the one that still had his reading glasses case beside it, and his small collection of reference books arranged exactly the way he had arranged them. Cooper lay beside the desk while she typed, the way he always lay beside her when she was doing something that kept her in one place for a long time. Cooper was 9 years old now. The gray had spread from his muzzle up toward his eyes. His movement was a little slower on cold mornings. His deep amber coat was still as rich as it had always been. He was not a young dog. Alina held this knowledge the way she had learned to hold difficult things, steadily, without looking away from it. She had a conversation with her veterinarian that spring. Dr. Anita Marsh had been Cooper's vet since the beginning. She was a direct woman who understood that Alina would want honest information. She told Alina that Cooper was in good health for his age. His heart was strong. His joints were managing well. His mind was sharp. She said golden retrievers of his age were often in the final portion of their natural lifespan. But she said that final portion could be long and good if the animal was well cared for. He clearly was. Alina drove home from that appointment and sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside. Then she went in and put his dinner down and watched him eat. And she thought about the particular arithmetic of loving something that will not outlast you. She had done this arithmetic before. She knew what the answer was. The answer was that it did not matter. The answer was that you loved anyway, fully and without holding anything back, because the alternative was not to love, and that was not something Alina Hayes was willing to consider. She had never been willing to consider it. Not with Harold, not with Cooper, not with anything she had ever given her heart to. She took him on his evening walk that night, the same route they always took. Down Sycamore Drive and left on Elm and around the block past the park and back up the other side to home. He walked at his usual pace, not fast but steady. He stopped where he always stopped. He came when she called. When they got back, she unlocked the front door and Cooper went inside and went straight to his water bowl and drank and then went to his blanket and lay down. Elinor stood in the hallway and watched him for a moment. The house was quiet. Not the quiet of absence. Not the quiet of a house that held only one person and all the empty spaces that used to hold another. A different quiet. The quiet of two beings at rest in a place that belonged to both of them. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to brush her teeth. She put on her reading glasses and sat in Harold's chair with the book she was halfway through. Cooper lifted his head when she came through the living room. His dark eyes found her. His tail moved once on the blanket. She sat down and opened the book. She read for an hour. Then she put the book on the side table and took off her glasses and looked at the ceiling. She thought about what she had said to Kevin Park. About love finding new places to go. She thought about Harold's coffee cup, 43 years of mornings. The folded paper towel. The smooth, empty nightstand the morning it was not there. She thought about a golden retriever pressing his nose against her fingers through the gate of a kennel on a Saturday in October when she had told herself she was only going to look. She thought about a dark garage. A wire crate. A dog lying completely still in the dark. Not because he was helpless. Not because he had given up. But because he had understood something that 3 men with years of experience and months of planning had never been able to understand. That being locked away did not mean being powerless. That paying attention was its own form of action. That love, when it had no other options, found a way. She turned off the lamp. In the dark, she could hear Cooper breathing at the foot of the chair. Slow and even and steady. The same sound she had learned to listen for in those first months after Harold. The sound that had returned her to sleep on the nights when sleep would not come on its own. She closed her eyes. Cooper breathed in the dark beside her, and the house was quiet and whole. Outside, Sycamore Drive was still. The oak trees held their bare branches against the winter sky. The porch light 2 houses down cast its small, warm circle on the sidewalk. Inside the ranch house, the lamp was off. The rooms were dark. And in the living room, a woman who had learned to hold difficult things steadily and without looking away was breathing slowly in her late husband's chair. And at her feet, a 9-year-old golden retriever with a graying muzzle and dark, steady eyes was keeping watch the way he always kept watch. Quietly, without asking for anything in return. Just present, just close. Just doing his part,